Hello all, my name is Merapelo Shana. I am the project coordinator for Selalelo, the Southern African project. This project was born out of a collaboration with Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity. And it is a program where we try to get African people and African Americans together so that we can talk about issues that affect all of us. In tonight's program, I have with me my guest, the chairperson of the Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity, and his name is A'Jamal Byndon. Good evening, A'Jamal.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
So the most interesting thing about this collaboration is the fact that we are learning from you, your organization, more. We are here in Southern Africa, and we have agreed and decided that we were going to find ways to get African people talking amongst themselves about issues and everything that can foster better unity among Africans, with the ultimate goal of actually taking the conversations to be a lot more deeper, so that we can talk to African Americans and other Black people wherever they may be, so that we can see how best we can move forward as the Black race in all issues that affect us, that include, racism, economic opportunities all over the world, and see if there's a way that we can collaborate. So one of the ways that we can best introduce this topic, I suppose, is for us to ask you, Mr. Byndon, can you tell us a little bit about your organization? What is your racial justice vision?
Well, thanks for inviting us. And again, our racial justice vision has to deal with basically the thing that we talk about is movement and racial equity program more deals with fighting racism, deal with anti-racism. We also engage in education events. We also engage in advocacy, as well as helping people to come together and facilitate meetings so they can come together and talk. So MORE is one of the very few organizations that has anti-racism, race equity, both fit within their mission in our community. There's a lot of people who dance around the word anti-racism or racism because they use all these euphemisms. So we kind of directly go straight up at the concept of racism because it has impacted us as Africans and African Americans throughout the world. So that's one of the issues we're about.
Okay, thank you. I am here in Botswana, in Southern Africa, and everybody knows that fewer races have endured as much racism as the Africans, whether they are here or whether they were taken to America. Now, this historical and even contemporary racism has far-reaching consequences on Africans. Now, as the chairman for the board of an organization that advocates racial equity in your own hometown in Omaha, what do you think it will take for racial minorities to achieve any decent regard from racial, majorities?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think what it's going to take for us to be all at the table, having discussions, challenging each other at a point, and also challenging external institutions. So one of the things that I think so often we don't do is we don't oftentimes come together. And I think one of the issues we got to do is do that. We also need to agree upon, we'll talk about a little bit later, maybe I'll talk a little bit more, hopefully, is we got to look at what are the outcomes, whatever things we want to get done. And I think more than anything, we have to look at our history. Again, we have to look at all these things that impact us as Africans and African Americans. And so in order for us to achieve some sense of these issues, it means we're going to have some benchmarks, kind of a litmus test, or the other word I might use, some kind of a barometer that will bring us into the room that we come to some common agreement. Malcolm X once said that one of the reasons why we're so in bad shape is because we don't have unity or we don't come together. And so I think as an organization, we got to know our histories, we got to know our culture, but we also got to learn how to put aside our differences to address these issues that impact us in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I totally understand that point of view. And seeing that here in Africa, you find that we have a legacy of colonialism, but now the colonialists have left the continent and we're having problems with unity in the aftermath. So I would be very interested in knowing what, the kind of solutions that promote peace, racial harmony and reconciliation that may be working on?
Well, that's a great question. Again, I think book reading groups may be a way to do that because sometimes people are very nervous when you talk about racial issues. So you may have to pick some books or articles that people have in common or very bestsellers and talk about that. Plocky is a good example for us in terms of Southern Africa, W. Du Bois, different people like that. The other thing we have to do, I think, is probably get together and have meals. Again, one of the things we can be very specific about is when you break bread with people, it's hard to be mad at them when you're eating food and having a wonderful time over dinner or supper or something like that. And then I think the other thing that we're doing and more is sometimes we see issues in our community and we see those contemporary issues, whatever they is in the village or whatever, and we bring leaders and community leaders. Sometimes we use the term credible messengers. We bring them together who sometimes may not be recognized by the status quo. Or those who are in position of power. So those are things we're trying to do. And we also try to lift up people who are what we call volunteers. There are a lot of people in our respective communities, villages, and our countries who don't get paid for doing certain things, but they do it on behalf of the common good. So we want to kind of lift them up and promote them and bring good people together and have hopefully some kind of opportunities that we can do that. And then I think more than anything is, and I will keep repeating this, we have to measure our outcomes. So whatever we do, we hope there could be social capital, social relationships among the various groups of people, both nationally and internationally. And once you get to develop friendship with other people, it makes a lot of this heavy lifting much more easier.
Absolutely. I'm in total agreement. And, some of the things that somebody might be asking themselves is, okay, you've said a whole lot of things that could be done to create, I suppose, an environment that can encourage this active participation that we are, talking about. So what else do you think can be done to make people feel more invested and more included in these conversations?
Yeah, I'm also one of the things I would suggest is the education institutions. So we got to kind of push back at some of our traditional systems that are institutionalized, like education, health, whatever, and see how we're all linked together. We're, as Native Americans would oftentimes say, we all belong to the same. Everything has a spirit. They even say the rock has a spirit. And so I think we got to start to see things in a much more holistic manner. I'm seeing people who do achieve things do so because they either brought together by commonality. Oftentimes, in some political circles, it could be negative. And as one elder in our community said, sometimes I vote not just for the person, I vote to get somebody, make sure somebody don't get into office. So there's different ways of looking at that paradigm. And again, when you talk to the elders in our community who have lived these rich and wonderful lives, we oftentimes have to sit at their feet and learn from them because again, each generation is born into an order and they must create and order in such a way that it can help the next generation. So I think one of the things we got to do, and I keep going back to this, is listen to our elders, make sure that we hear our mothers and fathers and parents and uncles and aunts and Malomies, you name it. And use some of the things that they can help transfer to us as younger than them to help that next generation that comes after us.
Oh, I see. Very insightful. And, I also think that there's a lot that can be achieved by having, I suppose, both the minorities, racial minorities and majorities to ensure that we get any measure of success. Now, what kind of support do you think would be required? Because we in Africa are the racial majority, but we still experience racism. And you are an African American where you are a racial minority. So it looks like on both sides of the coin, we have the same problem, but different circumstances. What kind of support do you think you need or we need as people of color, racial minorities of all kinds, from both ourselves as the minorities and those who are the majorities, who have the power?
As I started to read George Freckleston's book that talks about comparative analysis of South Africa and what happened in Southern Africa with colonization, enslavement, the whole apartheid emerging. And then I studied the same thing through his book, his lens, he's a white guy, of what happened in the Deep South during the Confederacy, slavery, and so on, enslavement of Africans. I learned one thing from that is that in order to make people whole, you have to have restitution and reparations. And again, we have millions of dollars that we're spending on useless things, wars, you name it, armament. and we could turn around and put some of those monies into helping people who deal with some of those historical traumas. In Botswana and in South Africa and in Namibia and in Zimbabwe, all these countries in Southern Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, I know the Swaziland, but Iswati, I think they changed their name. There are things that they suffered under apartheid, and they suffered under the brutal regimes of those folks who were the settlers. And so we have to go back and make sure that we make people whole again, just in the same way the Jewish people have held the Germans to accountability. So that's number one, finance. Number two, we really have to restart to healing, where we get people to deal with some of that internal pain and negativity and racism and so on. And we got to do that in a more holistic manner. And we also have to develop linkage across the ocean. I think we have a lot more in common than we're dissimilar, as sometimes people try to say that. I'm reminded of African Americans saying, I'm not from Africa, I'm black. I'm like, hold on. At some point, don't you know anything about your history? Europeans, white people in the United States always trace their ancestors back to Europe. And Asians go back to Asia. So we're the only confused group who've been so brainwashed, we think we're born inside of a turtle or something. No, we have a sense of connectedness and homelessness, and whether you acknowledge it or not, as they say, wherever you plant a mango, it's still a mango. So I think we have to begin to, again, educate ourselves. And some of that has to be done in the privacy of our families, our communities, and our close, our villages, you name it. And if we're not doing it, then we can't expect other people to do that for us.
I think it's actually sad that some of us have lost all knowledge of our histories. Even us in Africa are still struggling, because it's like we don't even understand the intensity and the depth of the racism that we endured during the colonization period, just because it was called colonization. You know, it looks like, it almost sometimes feels like it could be a much nicer term than the racism, you know. But anyway, and I'm just here wondering, Mr. Byndon, do you think that the majority, or those who wield power in terms of these uneven racial relationships, do you think they would be willing to give away some of the privilege and power and the wealth that they have accumulated through, you know, the injustices that they have perpetuated over the centuries at all?
That's an excellent question. I think we know history defines that they have not willingly just done it. If you look back at Black Lives Matter, you look at the Civil Rights Movement, you look at the anti-apartheid movements, we must bring pressure to bear. I mean, you look at what happened in India. So in all these places, people just didn't wake up one night and say, hey, we're going to do this to make amends for the wrong. We collectively have to demand and work on that, and not be complicit in our own oppression. You know, we have some handkerchief heads or people who we call sellouts or collaborators. We need to make sure that they're put in check, that they're not selling us down the river as some people have done. And again, I've been in situations where people think that somebody's going to wake up one day and have an awakening or epiphany and begin to do things differently to amend those wrongs. We have to, again, demand and push it. And again, when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, that was not an isolated incident. So we've been murdered by police officers in South Africa, in different places where the majority white folks controlled with their power in the United States. And during the Civil Rights Movement, even beforehand, there's documented by IDB Wells, there was over 5,000 lynchings, legal lynchings done by mobs where no one ever was brought to trial. Malcolm X said it was probably 10,000. So when you have those kind of judicial mob violence, you don't think it affects our communities, our people, and many people who left the South? And the same thing in Southern Africa. And what happened with Babata and some of those great leaders? Again, it affects us. And so we have to be much more vigilant. We have to be much more in control of our education and not allow them to push back and give us this whitewashed version that we all landed on Plymouth Rock, as Malcolm would say. As Malcolm says, Plymouth Rock landed on us. And again, the same thing in Southern Africa. We just didn't wake up one day and find our lands dispossessed. And if you look at the Native Land Act that was happening in 1913 area and so on in there, it was all about removing people from their land and putting them in enslavement camps and making them work for free for many of those Boers and those folks who are Afrikaners, and they pass that wealth on to their children, which affects us today, even in Southern Africa and so on. And plus, the mining industry impacted our communities in all those surrounding countries. And again, we see from the data from George Frederickson and so on that Africans were paid a lot less money than the white workers. We need some retribution for that.
You know, it is, I don't know, I have a feeling, a strange feeling when I hear you able to just narrate over a long period of time of what has happened to African people due to racism. And I'm also wondering, in groups, the groups that we have, for instance, what you are doing as more, what we are trying to do here as Selalelo, and many other groups like us, some of them are bigger than what we are doing. Some are bigger than us, some of them are smaller. Now, just how do you think we can know that we are on the right track as all these groups that are trying to push back at, the historical injustices or even that may be happening in this present time, in the 21st century, all the racism that's directed at the Black people or the brown people in all different aspects and in different locations around the globe? How will we know that we are on the right track?
I think there's 3 areas that we would know. Number one, we as Africans and African Americans are people who belong to the same, as I would say, group. We will see ourselves integrated within those systems. In other words, in our community, sometimes we have these great white saviors and they're serving our community in the middle of our communities or our village or whatever, and they're all controlled by white folks. So when we're at the top and the bottom, meaning part of the management, the board, and we've integrated as groups, and you can't distinguish our level in that organization because a lot of times you'll see us who look dark skinned at the bottom doing all the menial janitorial work. Now, don't get me wrong, janitorial work can be fine and good. It's a good living. But again, not every person is slated to do that. Number two, you'll see income distributions. When you have people who can say that our incomes are roughly 7 times less than white folks, or you have people, it would take them generations to equal the parity because someone got free land in the United States or South Africa or elsewhere. And I even think about my history of Botswana and the Tule Block, how that was reserved in the Queen's land and things like that. All that needs to be undone. And so land redistribution is a major factor. The other thing I think that goes into this, and the third I would probably put, is letting the people who are being aggrieved or negative by the impact define what they want to do. So again, there's an expression we use that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So when those people who we consider the least among us, use maybe a biblical terms, are basically going to be brought forward, and they're going to be the ones, our leaders in a sense, then we know we have arrived. And again, until we look at the eyes or these issues from the valleys versus the hills, you're not going to see any changes. As they say, there's an African proverb that says the eye cannot see itself. This is what we're talking about.
Wow. As you are talking, I was just thinking about what is actually happening back in Southern Africa. We have and I think it's happening in all over Africa, for instance, where we have now the drive for African governments to try and lure investors back into Africa. Remember that in the beginning, Africa was just being looted mercilessly by the colonizers. And then when they left and all the other African countries got their independence, now we are calling them back to come and open businesses so that we can try to scrape a meaningful, gainful employment from whatever businesses that they may have. And because we are all in Africa, we're the majority. I see a situation whereby the new investors coming in, ill-treating the African workers. And it almost looks like a conundrum of sorts, because how are you going to say that somebody that you invited in is ill-treating you? I hope you get what I'm saying. So when you look at the American example, you see that a lot of American companies, they will have statements against racial inequity, calling themselves equal opportunity employers. And, sometimes they even say, no, we are anti-racist employers. So do you think that minorities, for instance, in the American example, those who live who work in those kind of organizations that say that, they are anti-racist, do you think that their livelihoods have improved in any significant way? Is it something that can be measured and seen to say that all these companies that purport to be for racial equity, for instance, do you see it bearing any, meaningful fruit, if I can say?
I think it does for the elites or those who get inside those companies. For example, we just had a black guy who was the head of economic development in Nebraska, and he was doing some corrupt stuff, and he had a salary of $200,000. Yeah, he got a better income and he did well, but he didn't pass the love to other people who have advocated for him either. We have directors of departments. And so I would say, yes, it has gotten better for the elites or those who get inside the system who collaborate with those systems. But if you take all the income that we have as Black folks, African Americans, Africans, added up, it still does not equal the dominant group, mean white. Every now and then we'll pull a few cream of the crops off and put them on top of the kind of like a token positions. But at the end of the day, it has not changed their vast income levels. That our countries, our respective countries, all keep census data. We also keep data on what the gross national product is, also what is the average income of people. And if you add up all the folks, the amount of money that we're forced to live in our respective countries as Africans, African Americans, is much more smaller than what happens in Europe or smaller than what happens in the United States. So again, until you got the few getting all the money and pass it on to the many, we're going to have the same kind of paradox or the same kind of issues that we face in our respective locations. So again, we have to use empirical, evidence-based data to show that there's really not that improvement for the masses who are still suffering. And as Jimmy Cliff says, too many people are suffering, and it's been that way for generations. And we need to make sure that we get rid of some of those terms that that's not the case when we start to reverse the paradigm and invert it, the pyramid.
Wow. So as I was listening to you, and I was wrestling in my head with myself, wondering, are you saying that most of these organizations have some kind of a tokenism thing, carrot that they're dangling before Black people? Or is that, let me say this, is there like a legal requirement for people to treat people of color differently, when they employ them at all?
Well,
Is there anything like
I don't think, I think that on paper some of them say all this here, but if you look at it, many of them, it's obvious by how they treat the employees. And again, I think we probably have to do some surveys of people who work in those companies. And I worked at a company one time where the executive director sent a survey out and asked all the people to review it, and he sent it to another person outside the agency to review that. So they called it a 360 evaluation, meaning he got evaluated by the very people who we serve. We don't do that well in organizations. And I think one of the things that we got to do, especially when you look at these new companies coming into Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, whatever, they need some cultural sensitivity training. There are things you learn before you come into someone's country, how you do Medise and say, Dumela Ma, Dumela Ra, you name it, Sonny Banani. There's just things you learn as being courteous to people. And some of these folks come in here and expect they're in your country and they'll say, oh, you speak English with a strange accent. Well, I'm in the majority. How do you say that to me in a sense? So again, when we go into people's neighborhoods, our communities, and as natives say, we should always respect the land that we stand on, particularly when we have the original inhabitants standing there. So I think corporations and companies have to make a much more stronger policy that when they bring in these people, and sometimes we may call them carpetbaggers because they're just to make money and go back with their carpets. That's alluding to something that happened in the Negro in the South and so on, and how those white folks came down and became great white saviors. So I think we got to make sure we do that. And number two, when people are really sensitive to people's culture, they have a whole different analogy, and we don't say they and them, we say we and us. And we got to make that part of our national training program, and again, that should be a requirement, and make them pay for that. We shouldn't be using our own workers and using our own meager resources in our respective countries and in communities. We should make the folks who got the money pay for it, because again, they oftentimes are here just to do some more exploitation dances.
I hear you, and I'm also just wondering, because things are a little different here. I've never seen anybody in Africa, for instance, post-apartheid era. I've never seen anybody coming out to protest against racism, but we know that racism still exists in Africa, for instance. But in your case, in the United States, every now and then we see on TV, on the news, that Americans of all colors, for instance, come out to support African Americans. And they support them in their protest against systematic racism. Maybe that's where the difference is. Maybe we have racism, but it is not entrenched in the same way that it is over there. Now, why do you think that this is happening? Why do you think that you have these protests that happen every now and then in spurts, as a response to specific events? Why isn't there, maybe a perpetual campaign that can be sustained over a long period of time in order to get, meaningful results?
It's an excellent question again, and I really appreciate that. Part of the reasons why we don't have drivers, we don't have facilitators. We have, for example, in the United States, we have the National Urban League, we have the NAACP. Recently, after George Floyd was murdered and killed brutally by police officers in front of the world, we have Black Lives Matter. And if you look at each one of these organizations, they have pimped the situation. They have taken advantage of it, and they haven't did the kind of homework or built the infrastructure that's long-term working with the community. In our community in Omaha and other cities, we know these great civil rights organizations have been co-opted by the status quo. We look at what has happened during post-apartheid. Some of the very leaders who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement has gone to the other side. In other words, they've become very rich and wealthy. And in the meanwhile, people are still suffering in many of these villages, in these communities. Uitenhage, you look at that place. I mean, again, there's a high level of violence because people are very angry, they're poor. And I think some of the very people who we entrusted to carry the water back to the village have drunk it all up for themselves or so on. So we have to think of the paradigm that some of these institutions that were part of our struggle, oftentimes they get co-opted. And again, they're not helping us achieve the kind of equity and balance that we want with anti-apartheid and anti-racism behaviors.
Oh, sometimes it sounds somewhat depressing, actually, when you are a Black person, whether you're in Africa or anywhere else in the world, and you are trying to make sense of all this hostility directed at Africans. And you just wonder whether we can really make a difference. If you allow me to say this little comment, and just to say, do you think that we are fighting a losing battle, or do you think that we have not even started the battle yet as Africans, as African Americans? Because if you look at the statistics, they say that they have put the number of Black people in the whole wide world at around 1.6 billion or 2 billion or something like that in the whole world. So that is a sizable number as far as I can tell. And I'm just wondering why we are not able to demand respect on the global stage.
Wow. It's fascinating because one of the things that give me hope and pause is that I believe in our ancestors and those who guide us. And they speak to us in forms of dreams, metaphors, and proverbs. If you think about Sobukwe, you think about Biko, you think about all the great leaders, some hints that people we didn't talk about. People look at all these great leaders in these respective countries, and if we look at what they're about and we see what they overcame to get to where they're at, I'm reminded of Thomas Kuhn's book, The Scientific Revolution, that says we build our struggle and our issues on new thoughts and new creative ways of new ideas. And as long as we have a sense of faith, it's just like people who are very religious. You can't tell some of them something because they have faith that they're going to get to the afterlife. The same with us in the struggle. And Martin Luther King spoke of that very well when he said, I may not get there with you, but I believe that we will get to that mountaintop. Well, it's that same sense of love for each other. It's the same sense of mothers and fathers who love their kids and take care of their kids and work very hard in difficult jobs so that generation can succeed. And one of the greatest moments of joys for older people is to see their grandchildren and grandchildren do as best as they can based on things that they created. So I have a sense of optimistic, or a sense instead of being pessimistic, as some would say. I believe the glass is half full and the stuff instead of half empty. But I also know that each one of our generations can do much better and have done better when we understand what the roadmap that they had laid out for us. Sometimes we get lost on that journey to the promised land, as some will say, and sometimes we may go down rabbit holes. But if we follow those historical breadcrumbs and start to study what our people taught us orally, or what we have found from reading the books of Moffat or even Livingston or whatever, and put it in places where we come from as Africans and African Americans. And remember, what's his name? The whole Kute Kinte thing that was done by Alex Haley was because of some phraseology. If we start to study our own family culture and look at it, you'll see what our people did so that we're here today, and we actually stand on their shoulders. So I would come from a much more positive vanport and say our people have done a lot. In light of all the struggles we went through, I can't but have a sense of being saying, "Hey, it's going to be light at the end of the tunnel." Like Martin Luther King said, I may not see it, but I'm going to keep working so that at some point the generations who are not yet born will get there.
Very interesting. And I am here as the project coordinator for the Silalelo program. We are trying to get Africans to come closer together to talk about things that affect them and, hopefully help them find real unity. And when one looks at our long history as Black Africans dealing with discrimination and racism and all these nasty things, we've always had leaders at one point or another. Every epoch seems to have had its own leaders. In the 50s here in Africa, you had the Nkurumas, in South Africa. Excuse me?
I mean, there's so many African leaders we can name back in the 60s
yes,
and 70s.
There's so many. There's so many. Whether you're talking about the Sobukwes in South Africa or the Bikos, there have been so many. Now, what's happening right now in America, for instance, during the civil rights movement, you had many others as well that are known even up to today. In fact, those who are in the United States are known even more in Africa than they are elsewhere in the world. Yet we seem not to recognize our own leaders who helped us get somewhere as Africans. Now, Silalelo is here trying to do all these things. And I am just wondering, we are also trying to learn from you as the movement in Omaha for racial equity. Who do you think should be the leaders of the people to carry forward this dream into the next phase? Because from what I can sense, after the achievement of some civil rights for African Americans and after the independence of the last African countries to get independence, such as Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, those kind of countries, it's like activism has kind of slowed down. I suppose people were resting on their laurels a little bit to see how things were going to pan out. So, but when you look at the fact that now we're in a new century, the 21st century, we're still behind as Black people, we're still behind as Africans, we're still behind as African Americans, we're still behind as the Blacks in the Caribbeans and everywhere else, in Australia. What do you think the problem is? Who should lead us out of this quagmire that we seem to be stuck in, and who should lead us into the next, I suppose, leg of self-determination that we are all pining for? Who are the leaders today?
Yeah,
if they're not there, who should be?
Yeah, and here's how I will say this, and I say this very respectfully. I don't have anyone in mind at this point who I'd say are leaders, because again, I think leaders define themselves by who are their followers and then who make changes. Again, there are prominent spokespeople, self-serving sages, and you name it. But I think their leadership is out there. Oftentimes, they have not been elevated to the level that we may see them on the national level. Oftentimes, the leaders are community people. And again, some of the women, we don't even talk about women in our communities on the level we should. And again, some of them are the leaders by the fact they can lead their family. They have made sure their kids have been successful. We just celebrated Mother's Day recently. And again, part of it, I think we got to be careful is not to get caught in the cult of the personality. Merapelo, one of the things that I'm sensitive to is that too often we find out who the leaders are, and oftentimes they're handpicked, or they're the chosen ones. And I'm really sensitive that we should not get caught up in it's like, who are the followers and who can be the facilitators? There are a lot of us who don't get credit for just being behind the scenes, making sure things happen. Even Martin Luther King was a reluctant leader. He was a great speaker and so on, and he didn't want to do certain things. But at the end of the day, he was called. As they say, many are called, but few are chosen. And I think when you look in terms of Southern Africa, whether it be those respective countries related to the Salelo program and project, it's going to be those people who are emerging. And I think we have diamonds right among us. They just may need a little bit more polishing, and they will be like that carrot diamond that shines and brings other people to us. all we got to do is look at history and see what happens when we produce the Beagles or the Chris Haney and so on. Those are the kind of things that happen. And so one of the things we've learned that we sometimes should not put our best foot forward. And in the case of war, let me use that metaphor, even though I don't like to talk about battles and war, the general doesn't always go to the front like Patton did. They stand behind and direct traffic as older people or wise sages do when they're leading the troops into battle. We have to begin to think of this issue for equality in the same context of strategies and tactics and things like that, because as I learned from my parents and their parents is that people who get the prize sometimes will burn the midnight oil. Those who study hard, and as an old lady said to me one time, by the time you come up here, I've read the paper, had my coffee, and she said, "Don't run your dog up on my porch," meaning, don't come here with no foolishness because I, in a sense, know what's going on because I've been there and did that, and I was once young like you, and I learned from that. And I think we as Africans and African Americans and Black folks throughout the world need to listen to what answers are said. But I think leadership is one of the things we get caught in that quagmire where we get caught in these situations where people are either picked off or they're bought off or they do something or they're compromised. And I think there's another African proverb that says, strong people don't need strong leaders.
Wow. I think our conversation tonight has been very insightful. And as the program coordinator for Salalelo Project, I am very privileged to have had you speak to us so that you can motivate me and those who will follow this program so that we can see how you've done it, because we need synergy from different perspectives. So I think at this point, I can just ask you to give us any of your concluding remarks, closing comments, questions for me.
In recent months, I've been following the Botswana radio stations and the programs they put on Facebook Live, and some of the stuff they put out there is somewhat frivolous, and sometimes it doesn't deal with the issues of the struggle of our people. And if we want to be serious as Africans and African Americans, so we got to have to deal with transformation of people, societies, and groups, and so on. And we have to pull back and do some internal investment of ourselves and our people and make sure they understand our history. And again, I'm not mad at you, as Tupac said, but at the same time, if we're not again about building nations and building the lives of many of these people who have become disenchanted, we create this chaos or we create these high violence situations. So one of the things that I say to people is that is the squeeze worth the juice? What are we doing to make sure that we're measuring our existence against those who are much better than us? And also we must learn the difference between criticism and critique. We don't want to be putting people down, but again, it's a lot easier for somebody to have a word of kindness and about how you can prove something if they're in a relationship and they know you and they're part of your community. But we just don't expect knowledge to come from on high and help us to do stuff. And again, as we look at some people say, "Do as I say, not as I do." And as you know, Maya Angelou made the statement that sometimes what you say the first time is what we should believe. We have to begin to reverse. If we're going to be communicating to other people throughout the world and throughout our communities, we can't speak only into one language. And I say that very respectfully. Again, we need to know our own languages. But when someone comes to the room and they don't understand something as a teacher, in Southern Africa, many of the classrooms, when the whole class fail, they come after the teacher. In the United States, when the whole class fail, they blame all the students for not knowing how to do something. So we got to be very careful that we should not blame folks when we, again, have some sense of ownership in that failure of our respective communities. And my closing comments would be, if we're serious, we should leave a smoke fume or something, because when you see a an airplane, I switched up there, airplanes and cephalophaenia, when it's flying through the air, you'll see some smoke streams behind it. Oftentimes you may not see that, so maybe it isn't an airplane. If the car doesn't drive, is it really a car? And these are the kind of metaphors we need to ask ourselves. Again, what good is a gun if there's no bullet? And again, if we're talking about building a nation and community, we should make sure we create the best lifestyles for all the people based upon their existence where they're at. Nothing is more disingenuous or negative. So when somebody's eating food and the other person is starving, as Malcolm X said, just because we're all sitting at the table doesn't mean we're all diners. And this is the kind of the words I would leave you with. Malcolm's word is that, again, we need to be conscious of those who are at the bottom of our society, and we can measure the quality of our life, of our countries, not by the elites, but those who are at the very bottom, and we need to look at them first. Well, this is the end of our program, and we want to just kind of give you an update. We had an electrical power failure, so we were not able to continue. So we had to add on to say that This was an interview that was conducted by Merapelo Shana, who is in Botswana, talking to me about some of the issues related to Salelo and issues impacting on African Americans and Africans and how we can bring people together. So we hope you've enjoyed this edition. Join us a few editions of Salelo where we talk about how do we bring African Americans and Africans throughout the society together to talk about issues that impact us as we deal with these important racial and anti-racial issues. We hope you've enjoyed this show. Join us again for another edition as we go forward. As we always end, Baroko.